pentacle circle. It was a moonless night at my university dormitory. Everything was eerily quiet today. Amidst the darkness, two figures moved with silent purpose. Both of us were seniors, having spent months studying the occult. What started as curiosity had become an obsession. They had found an ancient grimoire buried deep in the library archives, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and spells. One ritual, in particular, had caught our attention, a summoning ritual. The old chapel, adjacent to the library, was my chosen location. It had been abandoned for years. The crumbling walls and shattered pews created an atmosphere of desolation. I entered through a broken window, our footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The air was thick with dust and decay. In the center of the chapel, they arranged the necessary items for the ritual, a circle with a pentacle drawn in paint and candles at each corner. I guessed we weren't the only ones daring enough to try this thrilling and terrifying experience. The air grew colder as we lit the candles, their flames flickering with an unnatural intensity. My friend Ada opened the grimoire, his hands trembling slightly as he began to chant the incantation in Latin. The words were foreign and harsh. I stood opposite Ada, my eyes closed in concentration. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, a palpable tension that set my nerves on edge. As Ada's chanting grew louder, the runes on the floor began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. Suddenly, the flames of the candles shot up, and the room was bathed in a blood-red light of horror. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel, seeming to come from the very walls themselves. Ada's voice wavered, but he pressed on, determined. The ground within the circle started to crack, dark tendrils of smoke seeping through the fissures. The smoke coalesced into a form, a figure with glowing red eyes. It was a shifting mass of darkness and malevolence. It was a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and bone, its form constantly shifting and morphing. The air around it seemed to hum with a sinister energy. It growled, whispering, muttering, hissing something incomprehensible. The malice in its tone was unmistakable. The shadows grew darker as Ata desperately tried to reverse the incantation. The entity's form wavered, but it remained. Its eyes seemed to burn brighter. It reached out with a clawed hand toward us. I grabbed a crucifix and thrust it towards the creature. The entity recoiled, a howl of rage filling the chapel. The shadows writhed and pulsed, but it seemed to grow angrier. He no longer read from the cursed book, but instead frantically recited prayers in a desperate plea. The entity paused, its form flickering, and then, with a final deafening roar, it dissipated into a cloud of smoke. We gasped for breath, our bodies trembling with fear. We stumbled out of the chapel. Behind us, the old building stood silent once more, as if the events of the past hour had never happened. I knew this would be the last time we meddled with such dark forces. We had been lucky to escape with our lives. As I left the chapel, the grimoire lay forgotten on the floor, its pages fluttering in the wind. It served as a reminder that some doors, once open, can never be fully closed. Curse Game. The scars on Lily's left side would haunt her forever. Lily had always been an adventurous soul, and her friends Emma and Claire were drawn to mysteries and the unknown. So when they stumbled upon an old, strange board game on eBay, rumored to be cursed and capable of summoning spirits, they couldn't resist. They decided to play it at Lily's house. Lily, Emma, and Claire gathered in the living room. The game, An old board with strange symbols carved into its surface and a small glowing crystal in the center seemed harmless. Claire, ever the skeptic, laughed as she read the ominous instructions aloud, daring the group to proceed. They all mocked the superstition, thinking it was just a game. Claire even cheerfully touched the crystal and recited the incantation. Lily giggled nervously.
This is ridiculous. I can't believe we're doing this.
Her fingers grazing the crystal. Emma pulled out her phone and started recording, eager to capture the fun.
All right, let's get this over with,
Emma said, reading the instructions aloud. She muttered the words with mock seriousness, placing her fingers on the crystal. Lily and Claire followed suit, though a growing unease crept over them. The words sounded strange, almost as if they weren't meant for human tongues. The atmosphere grew heavier as the ritual completed. At first, nothing happened. The lights flickered as they laughed at the absurdity of it all. But then, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Lily fumbled to turn on her phone flashlight. As its beam illuminated the room, they tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere had changed. Heavier, almost suffocating. As they gathered their things to leave, the three of them headed to the kitchen. The cabinet doors flung open with a loud bang, pots and pans crashing to the floor, echoing through the otherwise silent house. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. They slowly turned around. Standing at the doorway to the dark hallway was Sophie, their childhood friend. But Sophie had died 3 years ago in a car accident.
Is it really you?
Lily's voice trembled as she cautiously stepped forward. Sophie didn't reply. She just stood there, staring at them with lifeless eyes. As they stood frozen, the temperature plummeted further. Their breath turned to mist, and Sophie began moving toward them, her movements unnaturally slow, as if she were floating. Lily backed away, fear overwhelming her. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that made Sophie's form appear even more distorted. The growling sound grew louder, closer.
Get out now.
Claire screamed.
We have to leave.
Panic overtook them as they turned and ran toward the back door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. They turned to see Sophie, now standing in the middle of the living room, smiling. Suddenly, Claire screamed, clutching her arm where deep, bloody scratches had appeared. Her scream pierced the tense silence. Lily grabbed Claire's arm, trying to pull her away from the invisible claws seemingly attacking her. A shrill laughter filled the air, growing more frenzied with each passing second. Darkness enveloped Sophie, and they rushed to the basement, hoping to escape. There was a window there they could climb through. They raced down the stairs as Sophie's ghost followed. The basement door was stuck, but with combined effort, they managed to force it open. Lily fumbled with the window latch, her hands trembling as she tried to pry it open. Then, a force grabbed Lily, slamming her into the wall painfully. She felt a sharp, stabbing sensation in her side. Claire and Emma screamed, trying to pull Lily away from the invisible grip. Lily stumbled to her feet and opened the window. Claire went first, squeezing through the narrow gap. Emma followed, but as she began crawling out, Lily felt something cold and sticky touch her leg. With one final tug, Lily was pulled back inside along with her friends. Lily looked up to see Sophie standing there, her eyes blazing like fire. Perhaps she wanted something from them. Lily thought of the crystal. It was part of the game. They needed to get rid of it. She remembered seeing the crystal on the floor earlier. If it was the key to this nightmare, they had to destroy it. Lily ran back into the house, ignoring her friends' cries. Inside, the living room was in disarray, furniture overturned. Then she spotted the crystal, its dark surface reflecting the chaos around her. Determined, Lily grabbed it, a sharp pain shooting up her arm. Sophie reappeared, her face contorted with inexplicable anger. Lily threw the crystal with all her strength. It soared through the air and crashed onto the pavement outside, shattering into 1,000 pieces. As it shattered, the growling ceased. Sophie's image flickered and then vanished, leaving only an eerie silence. They stood there, gasping for breath, realizing it was finally over. As dawn broke, everything had finally ended. Lily and her friends huddled outside, their faces pale, etched with the terror they had just endured. The cursed game. The Willis family's house, her neighbors, stood quietly at the end of a dimly lit street. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Lily, who had done many jobs before, was starting her first day babysitting this time. The cozy living room was scattered with toys. Lily was greeted by Angie, a curious little girl. After listening to the parents' instructions and seeing them leave, the house was left to the two of them, growing silent. Angie leaned forward, her eyes lighting up mischievously.
Let's play a game. Call Mary.
Lily froze, letting out a nervous giggle. Angie tugged on Lily's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading.
Please, Lily. Just this once? I won't ask for anything else.
Lily hesitated, but Angie's persistence made her relent. Angie explained to Lily that they had to go into the bathroom, turn off all the lights, and say her name 3 times in front of the mirror. If they did, Mary would appear. They must not let the candle go out. Lily didn't really believe it and thought it was just a made-up game. The bathroom was dimly lit by flickering candles. Lily stood in front of the mirror. She took a deep breath and said,
All right, just this once.
and they'd go to bed. She called the woman's name. Before she could finish, Angie gasped and backed away, saying she didn't want to play anymore. Lily reassured her, saying it was fine, just a game, and it would end now. Then they'd go back to the room, just as they were about to leave. But then the candles suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. An icy chill swept over them. Lily led Angie out of the bathroom, but the house lights flickered erratically. From the bathroom, a soft whisper echoed throughout the house. Lily froze. Angie began to tear up and asked her,
What's that sound?
Before Lily could react, a figure, a woman, emerged from the bathroom, her hollow black eyes and mouth oozing a horrifying black sludge. Clutching Angie's hand, she began to step back. Together, they ran and hid in the dining room. Lily tried to turn on the lights, but they didn't work. It was as if they were trapped in another world. Lily pulled Angie under the dining table to hide from the ghost's pursuit. Through the gap beneath the tablecloth, Angie saw her bare feet shuffling closer. The floor creaked with each step. Lily ran to the bathroom. She quickly grabbed the matchbox from her pocket and lit the candles. Her hands trembled as she tried, but the flame refused to catch. It was too late. Behind Lily, she appeared, her distorted smile widening as she raised a pair of scissors. Lily panicked, dropping the matchbox and crawling backward, sobbing as she begged for mercy in vain. When Lily locked eyes with her, she felt pain engulf her entire body. She could do nothing but stare, the feeling worse than death. As the scissors slowly moved toward Lily's body, ready to tear through her skin and claim her life, Lily thought it was over. Then she heard the cry of a child. Suddenly, the lights came back on. Angie stood holding a candle and screamed.
Leave her alone.
Seeing this, Lily chanted her name 3 times to end the game. The candles suddenly flared to life. A piercing scream shook the house as she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Angie clung tightly to her.
She's gone, right?
Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark bathroom door. The Willis parents returned to find Angie asleep, with every light in the house on. Lily managed a tired smile. That day was Lily's first and last day as a babysitter. She had seen many things in her life, but nothing compared to what happened that night. Even if you don't believe, don't take the risk. The mysterious house in the deep forest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. Nick sat in the chair, lost in thought. He remembered what he had gone through and seemed unable to escape that feeling. In the late 80s, Nick and his friend Ken, both experienced hikers, decided to take a different route from their usual long-distance trails. They passed through the woods behind the farm, intrigued by a nearby ranch that raised exotic animals like cassowaries, strange and out of place in the countryside. They ventured deeper into the forest, the trees becoming denser as they moved further from familiar grounds. The air was filled with a damp smell as they pushed through thick underbrush, their excitement gradually building. As they continued walking, they strayed off the path and came upon an old, dilapidated house neither of them had seen before. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Just looking at the house gave Nick an ominous feeling, but they couldn't resist their purpose, to explore, so they naturally decided to go inside and check it out. Inside, the house had a very classic style, probably built in the late 40s or early 50s. But Ken saw and witnessed something even more terrifying. There were writings and symbols in strange, Latin-like languages about a worship ritual believed to be satanic or pagan. Some of the images depicted how to sacrifice human souls to an entity believed to be demonic, leaving them in disbelief. Ken exclaimed, as it was the first time he'd seen anything like it. To this day, and even at that moment, Nick still insists that some of the symbols painted on the walls were not merely red paint. The kitchen was cramped, and there was a narrow staircase leading upstairs. It was so tight that their shoulders would brush against the walls as they ascended. As they climbed the stairs, Nick felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He glanced back, but saw only Ken behind him. Ken stopped midway, frozen in place, insisting that he had seen a shadow dart across the stairs above. Nick forced a smile to reassure him, even though he too felt something was off. Their fear seemed to be increasingly palpable. The upstairs was pitch dark, with a room at the end of a narrow hallway. Leading to it were strange, dried red streaks that looked like blood seeping into the floor. As soon as they entered the room, they were confronted with many similar strange symbols. What caught their attention was the sight of chains with handcuffs hanging from the walls, as if someone had tried to lock something or someone in this very room. Then, the faint sound of chains clinking filled the room. The chains hanging on the walls began to sway, as if moved by an unseen force, despite the windows being tightly shut and no breeze present. Suddenly, they heard a noise, footsteps approaching from behind, resembling the sound of heels tapping on wood, quickly ascending the stairs behind them. Terrified, they ran down the stairs, but found no one there. The house fell silent once again, except for their labored breathing. There were no new footprints, only the ones they had left when they entered. Too frightened to stay, they decided to leave the house. But no matter which direction they took or how they used the compass, they tried it more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet, they always ended up standing in front of the house's main door. They tried again and again, walking in every conceivable direction, but the result was always the same. Caught in a disorienting and seemingly hopeless loop, they became utterly exhausted and terrified. Standing before the house one final time, they were met with something far worse. At that moment, Ken nearly fainted before looking up and pointing to the front-facing window on the second floor of the house. Nick and Ken crouched, frozen in fear. There it was, a figure. Yes, they both saw it. A tall, shadowy woman stood at the window, staring at them. Though they couldn't discern her facial features, her large, dark eyes were unmistakable. Then, she vanished instantly. Overcome with terror, they ran as fast as they could through the forest, eventually stopping at the edge of a federal road about 3 miles from the house. To this day, they still don't know how they managed to find their way back. It felt like a miracle. 5 years later, Nick and Kin decided to return to the house. But this time, when they arrived, the house had completely collapsed, leaving only rubble and debris. Nick later stumbled upon an online article about the house. Don was a man with unusual behavior. He had locked his mother in the attic and abused her for years, then used the house for his own sinister purposes. The weight of the truth slowly sank into Nick as he learned about the story and the dark history behind it. Now looking back, Nick realized that some things are better left buried, and some houses should never be revisited. The ghost train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, My breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. They left me. I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. The possession of the red dress. Ben, my best friend, and I went to a remote lakeside campground for a quiet weekend of fishing. The night air was cold, peaceful, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the water. We were enjoying this calm together. I suggested grilling the fish, and Ben agreed to gather firewood. He went to the forest's edge to find some. Along the way, he found a lot of dry branches scattered around, but then he saw something red in the darkness. As he got closer, he discovered a red dress. After a while, Ben returned with a bundle of firewood wrapped in the red dress. He intended to use it to start the fire, but I didn't pay much attention or think twice about using it as kindling. Not long after, we chatted while waiting for the fish to cook, but after a few seconds, Ben's face suddenly changed. When he stopped speaking, he made a strange noise from his throat. His attitude shifted, becoming oddly restless. Ben's eyes grew wild, and he suddenly became aggressively irrational. He grabbed the fish from the fire and started devouring it, even though it was still raw, as if he found it irresistibly delicious. I didn't understand why he was acting like that, but I was concerned the fish wasn't cooked. I decided to stop Ben from eating it all, fearing it might make him sick. Ben suddenly went berserk, yelling at me to give him the fish. That's when I realized something terrible had happened. Ben seemed to have lost his mind and control. Panicking, I had to restrain my friend. Eventually, I managed to calm Ben down, and he fell asleep. I was about to leave, planning to take him to the hospital to make sure he was okay. Since the situation seemed to have passed, I decided to take Ben home. It looked like it might rain, so we quickly left. It started pouring heavily. As I drove back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had been awakened by the red dress. Ben went home to his wife, but things got worse. That night, Ben started sleepwalking, something he had never done before. In the late hours, his wife was awakened by a strange noise. She saw him rummaging through the closet. He kept saying, "Wait for me," throwing clothes around, not responding to his wife, until he found his wife's red dress in the closet. Ben pulled it out and stared at it for a moment, then decided to put it on and went to bed, as if nothing had happened. His wife assumed he was just sleepwalking, so she said nothing. Ben's wife noticed that things were becoming increasingly strange since Ben went fishing with me, so she came to me for help. I returned to the lake, hoping to uncover or find something. I built a large fire to keep wild animals away from the old campsite. I returned to the old campsite. I was shocked to see that the dress was torn and scorched, yet still strangely intact, as if it had been deliberately left there. I realized the rain must have put out the fire that day. I walked through the forest to the places near where we had fished. Then my gaze was drawn to a rope tied to a tree branch, as if marking something. I approached and stumbled upon a corner of a notebook lying on the ground near the base of a tree, as though someone had buried it there. The journal revealed the tragic story of a woman named Elena, who had lived in the forest many years ago. She was known for wearing the same red dress, a gift from her lover. However, her love turned to jealousy and obsession, and after a tragic incident, she was murdered by him. Elena's spirit, bound to the red dress, sought to take the souls of others to keep her company in the afterlife. The dress served as a conduit for the spirit, and those who interacted with it would become vessels for her rage and obsession. I returned to the same spot. Ben was now kneeling at the base of the tree, staring at the scorched red dress. Then he reached for it. Ben suddenly lunged at me, becoming more aggressive like a beast. I struggled to overpower him to get the dress. I tried to wrestle Ben off to get the dress. Desperate, I grabbed the red dress and threw it into the fire I had built earlier. This time, I had to make sure it burned completely. As the dress burned, Ben collapsed to the ground, his face twisted in agony, as if he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. Ben's eyes were filled with confusion and horror as he stared at the dress still burning. In the days that followed, Ben tried to return to normal life, but he remained haunted by the red dress and the woman in the forest. Every time he saw the color red, he became terrified. After everything that happened, I too was affected by what I had witnessed, but I tried to forget it. Believing the worst was finally behind us. The curse of the doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, While alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claw looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claw, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll, seemingly unaware of the curse. She was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. Vengeance of the soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, The police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. The town's haunted mystery. It was during one of our arguments, moving from yelling to an uncomfortable silence. Kira suggested, almost hesitantly, maybe we just need to leave. Start somewhere new. She stared at the wall, her voice trembling. I thought differently. I didn't believe a change of scenery would solve anything, but despair hung thick in the air between us. We'd gone through endless nonsense for months, arguing over small things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes, which then escalated into intense fights. Our little daughter, Lily, would stand in the corner, clutching her toy, her eyes sad as if she understood more than we realized. The arguments became unbearable, and I felt as though our family was crumbling day by day. The drive to our new town was filled with silence. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow on the horizon as we traded one skyline for endless fields. I cracked the window, breathing in fresh air, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Kira smiled at me, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Eventually, we drove up to our new house. It was a small, cozy old building nestled among others on the street. As we unpacked, I felt a flicker of hope. It was the first time I saw her. Margaret, an elderly woman in a sweater and long skirt, stood on the sidewalk, She waved as she saw us, holding a plate of cookies to welcome us to the neighborhood. As we exchanged pleasantries, I noticed a girl standing behind Margaret, around Lily's age but with a troubling paleness. Then she complimented my daughter. I replied, trying to smile politely, but something about Margaret felt strange. Her enthusiasm was odd. Suddenly, she turned serious, mentioning a certain well. She began to tell me about a wishing well in town, urging me to bring Lily there, assuring me she would love it. A wishing well. I found it rather strange, like a local legend from where I lived. She said it would bring luck to anyone who made a wish and tossed in a coin, a tradition spanning generations. The conversation made me uncomfortable. Kira shrugged, but I felt a chill as I watched Margaret leave, the girl following her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in atmosphere worked wonders for our family. Kira and I argued less, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space of our new home. The townsfolk were friendly and laid back. Yet, the well kept coming up in conversation. I overheard a cashier mention it, saying, "The well changed my life." At work, my coworkers talked about it as if it were some sort of miracle. Finally, one night, I mentioned it to Kira, about everyone's obsession with this well. She just thought it was probably one of their local traditions. But the unease grew heavier. The atmosphere at work changed. My hours were cut, and coworkers became distant. It felt like something was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Kira's mood turned dark, and we argued over trivial things again. One night, I was wandering through the forest. I stumbled upon the well. It stood ominously in a clearing, its stone walls oddly slick. I could feel the weight of the town's tradition pulling me back. What if I made a wish? Desperation clawed within me. I approached the well, heart pounding. I had nothing left to lose. I pulled a quarter from my pocket, thinking of my family, of needing things to get better. I tossed the coin in, wishing for things to improve. A silence fell over me as I turned to leave. At that moment, Margaret appeared, her smile wide and unsettling. "You made a wish, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread rising within me. She simply said, "It will come true," and then smiled, walking away. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar warmth in bed. Kira lay beside me, her face peaceful. I glanced around, feeling a weight lift from my chest. I had a strange feeling of hope, as though everything was falling back into place. Breakfast was a cheerful event, laughter filling the room. It felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted. We were happy, almost too happy. But a small part of me felt something wasn't quite right. And everything from that day began that night. While lying in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of insecurity. Something is wrong. Lily's scream broke the silence, and I rushed to my child's room. Lily trembled, her eyes wide open in fear as she cried and pointed to me that there was a monster in the window. I hurried to the window, pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the trees. What is happening? I whispered to myself, feeling panic rise within me. I turned back to Lily, who was still staring at the window, pale and terrified. I stood frozen, trying to comfort her in my arms, though the unease gnawed at me. I stayed up late that night, with Lily between Kira and me. Kira, exhausted from sleepless nights, drifted off, leaving me on high alert. The following days were a chaotic mix of anxiety and paranoia. Lily's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, and each time, I found myself jolted awake by her screams. I tried to distract myself with errands around town, but whispers seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The locals had hollow smiles, with something in their eyes I couldn't quite identify. It felt like the whole town was watching me. Everything will be fine, a cheerful cashier said as I bought groceries, but her smile felt like a mask hiding something sinister. Just make a wish by the well. I never wanted this nightmare. I never wanted my family involved in any twisted game. One evening, after another night of Lily's screams, I found myself back at the well, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The air was tense as I approached, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. As I stood there, I noticed the well's surface glistening under the moonlight, almost inviting me. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The chill of the night air made me shiver. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched washed over me once again. I felt a presence lurking in the darkness, and panic took over. I ran home, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. Kira was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I quickly ran to Lily's room to check on her and saw she was fast asleep. But when I looked closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Something wasn't right. I went back to Kira, pacing the floor, my mind spinning. We need to do something. This can't keep happening. Kira's gaze was distant, lost in thought. She said to me, "Maybe we should leave. We could pack up and go somewhere else." "No," I snapped stubbornly, feeling the weight of despair. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fix this." That night, I decided to confront Margaret. I needed to know the truth. With my heart racing, I left the house and headed to hers. As I approached, the atmosphere changed. I knocked on the door, fear rising within me. She greeted me with a smile that seemed friendly, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I desperately told her I needed to know what was happening. Her expression turned serious, her eyes narrowing. "You know, wishes come with consequences," she said softly. Leaning closer, "You wished for things to be better, but what if there's a cost?" I felt myself unraveling as she kept talking about what I had lost. She tilted her head, that predatory smile returning. "It's not always clear. Sometimes you get what you wish for by sacrificing something else, something precious." I stumbled back, wondering if I had traded my daughter's happiness for a hollow life. When I returned home, I found Lily in her room, but she wasn't the girl I once knew. Laughter seemed to have been replaced by an eerie silence. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like an empty shell. Regret weighed heavily on me. I had wanted to fix everything, but I had only made it worse, foolishly believing in something dark and twisted. I returned to the well, desperate to undo my wish. I knelt by the edge, staring into the darkness. I want my daughter back. I didn't want this to happen, but the well remained silent. Days passed, and our home became like a prison as Lily worsened, her strange behaviors leaving me helpless and heartbroken, unsure of what to do. Every time I went outside, those around me kept smiling, but their eyes hid a secret, a dark truth I could never grasp. They too had made their wishes, and I was just another pawn in their game. In the end, I made a decision. I would play the game, just like Margaret had. I would find another family and make them wish, too, to replace my daughter. As I walked through the town, I spotted a family moving in down the street, a young couple with a little girl who looked just like Lily. I approached them, a smile spreading across my face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, hiding the darkness within. And no, with a new cast in the pipeline. Maybe the darkness had clouded my vision and taken over. I didn't know when this would end or if there was any escape. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Perhaps I had to be the villain, to save my daughter, my family. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient. And I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me.
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira, "Help you? Tell me how." Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment. The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. The Echo of the Hunter. It was an afternoon. Leo had been restless all day, so he decided to take Max for a walk to a nearby field. It was spacious, airy, and peaceful. However, as they ventured deeper into the field, Leo started hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like someone groaning, but he ignored it. Shortly after, a figure emerged from the trees. A man wearing a long black coat. Leo wondered who would wear a long coat in such hot weather. For some reason, he had a bad feeling. He quickly hid behind a tree, hoping the man hadn't seen him. He crouched down and commanded his dog to stay quiet. Thankfully, Max was always an obedient pup. The man lingered for a moment, but eventually walked away. A few minutes later, Leo could no longer hear his footsteps. He thought he was safe, but just as he started to leave with his dog, Leo heard that eerie groaning sound again behind him. At first, Leo hesitated, but he slowly turned around to see what was happening. He wished no one would ever have to experience something like this, because what he saw at that moment would become the worst nightmare of his life. He was there, standing still, staring at Leo. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman. Her clothes were torn and stained with something dark. Leo didn't want to think about. She was holding a knife. Her eerie smile twisted in a way that made her look completely insane.
Max, run!
Leo turned and sprinted away. He was halfway through the field when, in his frantic escape, he tripped and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his knee as he hit the ground and skidded forward. The woman's laughter echoed behind him. As he tried to get up, he realized his foot had been impaled by a shard of glass from a broken beer bottle. But there was no time. He summoned all his strength and yanked it out. It was difficult to stand and run. Leo struggled to crawl forward, knowing they had surely seen him and would catch up in no time. The woman got closer.
Leave me alone.
He screamed at them, hoping someone would hear his cries for help. But there was no one around. Max, Leo's dog, stood in front of him and began growling at the woman. Just as she moved to strike, Max lunged and sank his teeth into her leg, making her scream in agony. In retaliation, she threw his dog to the ground, injuring it severely. An uncontrollable rage surged within Leo. He got up and saw that she was wounded at the hip, so he lunged at her, causing her immense pain. But before Leo could catch his breath, a sharp pain shot through his spine. As Leo collapsed to the ground, he saw the man standing behind him. The man had stabbed him, making Leo fall, gasping for air as the world spun around him. Leo thought he was about to die, and in those final moments before closing his eyes, a gunshot rang out beside him. It was Leo's neighbor. He was holding a hunting rifle and had shot the man in the hand, making him scream in pain. Later, the neighbor told Leo that he had been out hunting and, upon reaching the field, had hurt him. His hunting dogs had charged at the man and bitten him. The neighbor then rushed to help Leo stand up, but Leo insisted that he help his dog first instead of him. Then he finally passed out. When Leo woke up, he was in the hospital with his neighbor standing beside him. He told Leo that his dog had been taken to the vet and had miraculously survived. The man who attacked Leo was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital, but the woman didn't survive due to excessive blood loss. It turned out that they were dangerous criminals who had escaped from the mental institution together. Later, my neighbor lost his right to own firearms because he had shot someone, but he didn't care. He said he had done the right thing to save lives. Leo also felt incredibly lucky to be alive. Horror menu at fast food store. Alex was working the third shift at a local Wendy's to pay for his tuition. The job was nothing special, just the occasional late-night customer, making things a little more interesting. That night, he spent most of his shift sweeping and wiping down counters. Just as he thought he was going to die of boredom, a car pulled up to the drive-through speaker. Alex set down his rag, put on his headset, and said,
Welcome to Wendy's. What can I get for you?
The car pulled up to the pickup window, and the order was unusually large, 50 chicken nuggets and 10 double cheeseburgers. Alex entered the order into the computer, feeling sorry for his coworker, Brad, who was the only cook on shift. Brad would have to make all of that food by himself. Alex asked if he wanted anything else, but the man remained silent and simply drove up to the window. A pickup truck. The man's vehicle was white, coated in a thick layer of grime on the windshield and windows, with patches of rust and dents. As the driver's window rolled down, Alex finally saw him. The man was unsettling. He had pale, sunken eyes with dark purple circles underneath. He was sweating and looked restless. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Strange scars ran down his arms, as if something had gnawed on his limbs. Alex tried not to stare and opened the window. A horrific stench wafted out from the truck, a smell like a rotting swamp. The man said nothing. He simply handed Alex a crumpled $50 bill. Alex took the money, trying to remain calm despite the man's scarred arms and the truck's overwhelming stench. One thing Alex had learned working in fast food was to avoid conflict at all costs. He handed the man his change and directed him to the designated waiting spot for large orders. Alex told him he'd bring the food out when it was ready, but the man just stared at him with those hollow eyes. Then, the man muttered something repeatedly. Sandy is so hungry. Alex quickly told him the food would be ready soon and shut the window. But the man didn't move. He didn't park where Alex had directed him. Alex waited for Brad to start passing the food through the window. But after 5 minutes, Brad had only prepared 20 nuggets and 2 burgers. After a few minutes of waiting, he started knocking on the window, demanding his food. When Alex opened the window to check, the man insisted, "Sandy won't wait any longer." Alex could only nod, promising to hurry before quickly shutting the window. Less than 2 minutes passed before he knocked again. This time, he reached out, grabbed Alex by the collar, and snarled,
Sandy won't wait anymore. Do you want me to feed you to her?
Panicked, Alex shoved him away and demanded he leave. The man growled, jumped into his truck, and sped off into the night. About half an hour passed with no customers, so Alex and Brad sat in the kitchen, chatting. Suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, the power in the store cut out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Alex and Brad froze, turning toward the noise. He had come back. He stood at the window, no longer in his truck, this time clutching a large sack against his chest. His pale lips curled into a sickening smile. Then, to Alex's horror, he pushed open the window.
Sandy needs to eat.
Brad lunged toward the window in rage. The man opened the sack and dumped its contents into the store. Something heavy and wet hit the floor with a sickening sound. Alex squinted, trying to make sense of it. The horrific sound sent chills down Alex's spine. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. What he saw would haunt him forever. It was an alligator. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws around Brad's ankle. Brad screamed in agony. The lunatic at the window giggled. Sandy's hungry. Sandy's hungry, he repeated over and over. Alex grabbed a cast iron pan and swung it with all his strength at the alligator. It screeched and backed off for a moment. In a frenzy, Alex yanked Brad into the kitchen and slammed the door shut behind them. He dialed 911 as they waited in terror, the sound of claws scraping against the floor and the lunatic's distorted mumblings echoing outside. After 10 agonizing minutes, the police arrived and arrested the man. Yet he still wore that deranged, inexplicable grin. Animal control arrived a few minutes later, sedated the alligator, and transported it to a wildlife sanctuary. The shadow of the truth of school. Everything began when rumors spread across the school about a series of students mysteriously disappearing. The administration remained silent, with no official statements, but whispers filled the hallways. Lena was a quiet, diligent student who often immersed herself in schoolwork. She loved solving puzzles, seeking answers to difficult questions, and spending hours reading books. Some people said the students had run away. Others believed something darker was happening. Lena noticed the growing number of empty seats in her class, the somber faces of teachers, and the whispered conversations among students created a heavy atmosphere, and a sense of unease loomed over the school. Lena, always logical, dismissed the idea of anything supernatural or strange. But when Anna, a classmate she'd known for years, vanished without a trace, Lena became increasingly curious. Anna was supposed to meet Lena at the library, but she never showed up. The next day, Lena discovered Anna had joined the list of missing students with no explanation. She started piecing together the timeline of the disappearances, observing the dates and times when students went missing. It was always the same. They disappeared after a specific time, during the late hours of night school, after extracurricular activities had ended. Lena's curiosity led her to the school library, where she found old newspapers describing similar cases from years ago. She discovered an old yearbook featuring photos of students who had been part of a club years ago. Strangely, many of those photos were now listed as missing in old newspaper articles. One evening, as she stayed late studying, she heard faint noises from the hallway. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a woman with long blonde hair running past. Strangely, she didn't recognize the woman, and the timing seemed odd for someone to be running around the school building. Curious and uneasy, Lena decided to follow her. She trailed the blonde woman through the dark hallways of the school, staying out of sight. The woman's behavior was erratic. She seemed scared and confused, as if fleeing from something. The woman ran toward a man, He was tall and well-dressed, but something about her demeanor compelled Lena to follow. It was unusual, almost fearful. Lena decided to follow the man. She watched them leave the building, heading toward a secluded area near the school. The two entered an abandoned building, and for a moment, Lena hesitated. She followed them into the eerie darkness of the building, but just as she was about to step inside, she heard the woman's scream echoing through the night. Lena froze in place. It was too late to turn back. She cautiously stepped into the dark hallway of the building, the cries from afar growing louder. She moved toward a faint light at the end of the hallway, emanating from a slightly ajar room. As Lena approached, she could see photos on the walls, featuring blonde-haired girls. The names of the girls were written beneath their photos, but one name made her freeze in her tracks: Anna. She was stunned to see her own photo, following that of the girl she had just seen. Lena scanned the room and saw two blonde-haired girls, and to her horror, one of them was Anna. Both girls were emaciated, their hair crudely chopped. And then, he began to approach. Lena quickly backed away as she heard the man's voice. Anna's voice echoed in the room.
Jack, please forgive me.
She pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Lena suddenly realized that this Jack was far from ordinary, and he was not someone she should confront. She needed to stay calm and avoid drawing attention. She decided to quietly leave. She left the abandoned building, found a safe spot, and quietly called the police. In the end, the truth came to light, and Jack was arrested. Investigations revealed that Jack had a troubled past. He was once a boy who was rejected by a blonde girl he loved. Jack was an unassuming, chubby boy with an unremarkable appearance. He confessed his love to a blonde girl, but she mocked him as fat in front of everyone and rejected his feelings. After years of bullying and humiliation, especially that public rejection, his anger grew. His hatred festered, and now, whenever he saw blonde-haired girls, he loathed them. Regardless of who they were, he imprisoned them, cut their hair, and starved them into frailty. Lena felt fortunate to have uncovered the truth early and lucky that she was not the next victim, along with those who came after. Secrets hidden in the basement. Leo, a college student desperate to find a job during his winter break, stumbled upon a strange ad on Craigslist. The ad lacked details, but the salary was too good to pass up for a simple housekeeping job at the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Donovan. At the end of the ad, there was a phone number. An elderly woman answered the call and gave him an address to visit the next day. The next day, Leo arrived at Mrs. Donovan's house, a peculiar old wooden house surrounded by a vast garden of towering red roses. Their charcoal black stems stood out against the vibrant petals. Mrs. Donovan warmly welcomed him, an elderly woman with sharp gray eyes and an air of mystery. She gave him a tour of the large house, filled with books on botany and strange plants. Her library was vast, and there was something about those books that made him feel uneasy. Then she led Leo out to the garden, full of strange plants, especially the roses he had noticed earlier. She began praising the roses as the work of her life and gave him detailed instructions on how to care for the garden. Inside, she offered Leo a cup of coffee and instructed him on some tasks around the house while she was out. She said,
"Everything must be cared for as it is when I leave. Just tend to the plants. One rule, don't go into the basement."
At first, Leo found her expression a bit odd, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Many people have restrictions on certain rooms in their homes. His curiosity was piqued, but soon set aside. After Mrs. Donovan left, he spent the next few hours tending to the plants, ensuring each was watered and cared for properly. Leo took a deep breath and noticed something odd. The scent of the flowers was overpowering, almost metallic. Moreover, the rose petals were much thicker than a typical rose. Just then, a bee buzzed past Leo's head, startling him as he grabbed a rose. The red petals crumbled in his hand, but something was strange. His hand felt slick and sticky. Leo opened his palm. A thick red liquid oozed from the broken petals, staining his hand. It was unlike any flower Leo had ever seen. It looked like blood. Shuddering, Leo rushed back inside to wash his hands. Suddenly, he heard an echoing noise from the basement. It grew louder, like a cry for help. Despite Mrs. Donovan's strict instructions, curiosity and concern drove Leo to the basement door. He descended the stairs, the faint light from his phone illuminating a metal door hidden at the end of the hallway. A faint whimper sent chills down his spine. Something was terribly wrong behind that door. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Iron cages lined the walls. From one of them, he heard a faint plea for help.
Help me.
Then he saw her, a young woman curled up in the corner of a cage, her pale face covered in scratches, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition. Leo was shocked and horrified. The woman explained that Mrs. Donovan had kept her imprisoned and fed her body to her monstrous plants. Just as he began planning her rescue, he heard the front door open. Mrs. Donovan had returned unexpectedly. As she entered, dragging a large suitcase behind her, Leo tried to remain calm, pretending everything was normal. She squinted, tilting her head as she studied him.
You look pale. Are you okay?
Mrs. Donovan's smile vanished. Her gaze shifted toward the basement door, then back to Leo.
You went somewhere you shouldn't have, didn't you?
Mrs. Donovan suddenly grabbed a pruning knife from her suitcase and slashed at Leo. He dodged, the blade striking wood and splintering it. Leo shoved a chair forward, knocking her off balance, then sprinted toward the basement, slamming the door behind him and locking it with a rusty latch. Leo reached for his phone but realized it was missing. Panic surged within him. Then he remembered the landline phone in the kitchen. He needed to get there without being caught by Mrs. Donovan. Leo spotted a broom and an old coat in the corner of the basement. Quickly, he propped the broom against the wall, draped the coat over it to mimic a human figure, then grabbed a pipe from the floor and hurled it against the wall to create a loud noise. The distraction worked. As she stormed through the door, it gave Leo just enough time to slip into the kitchen. He dashed to the phone, grabbed the landline, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. She realized and quickly returned. Leo grabbed a pan from the counter and struck her arm, causing the knife to drop to the floor.
Help! She's trying to kill me.
Leo screamed into the phone, his voice desperate. Leo dodged, grabbed a bottle of fertilizer from the counter, and hurled it into her face. The powder temporarily blinded her, giving Leo a chance to grab the knife and point it at her. Her wild grin sent shivers down his spine. The front door burst open, and police stormed in. Mrs. Donovan lunged desperately at Leo, but the officers tackled her to the ground and restrained her. Shortly after, her garden was destroyed and burned to ashes by authorities. They uncovered the horrifying truth about Mrs. Donovan's experiments with carnivorous plants that thrived on blood and human flesh. The truth about her dark experiments was revealed. She was sent to a mental institution where she would spend the rest of her life. This nightmare was something Leo would never forget. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day.
Mom, where are you? I'm cold.
That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard,
Mom, where are you?
I slowly pushed the door open. The the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered,
Mom, where is she?
I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate.
Where is my mom? I want to see her.
As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper.
Thank you.
I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. Ghost in the Gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room. As usual, Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloody child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. Haunting on the midnight train. The town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
Are you sure about this, son?
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. It's just a train ride. I'll be back. The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever.